Welcome everyone. This is our second event for the Society of American Archivists student chapter at San Jose State University for the spring semester. So we're excited you could join us. My name is Allison Kirion. I am the current chair and we have a great event for you tonight. So just a couple of reminders. Please keep your cameras and your mics turned off just so we can have a smooth and non-glitchy experience. We are recording this presentation, so if you want to review it later or you know someone who missed it and you think they might be interested, we should have it posted to our YouTube channel within a week. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to our Vice Chair, Samantha Hamilton, to introduce our guests for tonight.
Thank you, Allison. Welcome, fellow SJSU Spartans, to the second SAASC event this semester. My name is Samantha Hamilton, and I'm the Vice Chair of SAASC. Tonight, I'm really excited to have two special archivists join us to discuss their admirable work with the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, or A4BLIP. This group responds to issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement, and they try to make progressive changes to how we document and preserve the Black experience. So with that, I'd like to introduce the archivists Beaudry, Allen, and Faith Charlton.
Hi, thanks very much, Samantha. Thanks to everyone for having us here to speak about Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia. Like Samantha said, my name is Faith Charlton. I'm the lead processing archivist for the Manuscripts Division Collections at Princeton University Library. Speaking along with me, or presenting along with me, is Beaudry Allen, who's the Preservation and Digital Archivist at Villanova University. And we are two of 4 members of the steering committee or organizing team, as we've been referring to ourselves for A4BLIP. And just to start, we'd like to acknowledge that we're joining you. I'm in Southern New Jersey and Beaudry's in Philadelphia. And both of these areas are part of the unceded traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape. And take it away, Beaudry.
Great, thank you. So it's actually really exciting to start our presentation off to state Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia is a term that can be found in SAA's Dictionary for Archives terminology. The entry itself is a representation of SAA recognizing the group efforts and our impact. So what we are is a loose volunteer organization of archivists, librarians, and other information professionals established by a group of Philadelphia area professionals in response to the issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement. So what is A4BLIP? It was founded 4 years ago by Rachel Appel, a librarian at University of Pennsylvania, in response to Princeton University's former digital archivist Jarrett Drake's 2016 ALA address, in which he talked about his work to end archives' erasure of Black lives and coined the hashtag Archives for Black Lives. Rachel rallied a group of Philadelphia area archivists to draft a statement, which was released in January 2017, and this statement formed the group A4BLIP. The group is currently managed by a 4-person organizing team or steering committee, and we have a website, a listserv that reaches over 150 people who we consider our members. And we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Jarrett Drake's ideas and work, as well as many other individuals in libraries and archives who have influenced us in our efforts to tackle issues related to social justice, radical empathy, community archives, anti-oppressive description in a myriad of ways. And here are a few listed. And if you're more interested in seeing how some of this has been developed into other projects, I recommend checking out Project Stand, an archival consortium, and archivists supporting activists. So, as I mentioned, the first thing A4BLIP did was draft this statement, which we released on GitHub It serves as a value statement, a mission statement, as well as a call to action. It acknowledges the fact that archives are located within systems of and have perpetuated white supremacy, and urges archivists to actively engage initiatives that support Black people and Black history as a part of their responsibility of creating, preserving, and making accessible the historical record. As a primarily white group, we largely seek to push white archivists to deconstruct white supremacy in the archives and within the profession. So one of the first pillars of our statement is to collect, support, and lift up Black history narratives. Most collections in archives are by and about white people. In our statement, we call on archivists to support Black history by seeking out such records and with a sensitivity to donor preferences and needs, either preserve those records in traditional archives or support the efforts to keep these records in community archives. The second point is to make archival spaces more inclusive. SAA surveyed in 2004 and 2017 indicate our profession is 90% white. Moreover, archives are often situated within institutions of power that reinforce systematic oppression. Archives have been and often still are inaccessible or unwelcoming to marginalized groups. The third pillar of our statement is that as archivists, as records professionals, we have a responsibility to advocate for appropriate policies and practices surrounding police and correctional records. We write in our statement, we believe archives exist to hold power to account, to speak truth to power, because records serve as evidence for factual claims. It is archivists' responsibility as stewards of records to stand against their exploitation or abuse. We feel this applies to police-worn body cam footage and other records of police action.
AFRBLIP currently has 3 working groups: the Antiracist Description Working Group, which seeks to address oppressive archival description, the Community Archives Group, which looks to support community-based archival collections, and an outcome-oriented reading group. Both the Community Archives and Description groups were established in 2017 based on a survey organizers sent to members to see what initiatives of those outlined in the group statement they wanted to focus on. The current reading group, which Beaudry will talk about in more detail, is a revised version of a group that initially began in 2018. Next. The Anti-Racist Description Working Group has 7 members, 5 white women and 2 Black women, all professionals who work at predominantly white institutions or PWIs, including Princeton and Temple University. The initiative for drafting anti-racist description resources was inspired by Teresa Rayford, a Portland, Oregon-based activist and founder of the organization Don't Shoot Portland, with whom AFRBLIP had collaborated at SAA's Liberated Archive Forum in 2017. Rayford inquired as to whether the group had any recommendations for how she might approach a catalog audit. She wanted to initiate a project at Oregon State Library after learning about a racist catalog card that a librarian there had shared on Twitter. AFRBLIP members realized that this was an area that lacked guidance for those doing archival description. Members of the group were aware of racist description in their institution's catalog records and finding aids, but none of us knew of any specific guidelines for how to address this in a programmatic way. As a way to both provide a framework for audits of racist description at our own institutions and to hopefully provide guidance that would be useful to other archivists, we decided to create a set of recommendations. Excuse me. The group, which had considerably more folks working on it at the outset, not surprisingly dwindled as time went on, as all of this work was being done on a volunteer basis. Princeton staff in particular were fortunate in that they had the ability to set aside some time during work hours to concentrate on the project as part of professional development work. Next. Oh, you got it. Thank you. We began by working on a bibliography of sources, recognizing that this issue was not new nor solved. It serves to gather and amplify the work of archivists and librarians across the field who are already theorizing or who have been theorizing and practicing anti-oppressive description. We incorporated some of these works into an annotated bibliography, which focuses on the broader theoretical frameworks that informed our practical recommendations. The metadata recommendations are meant for archival professionals to address racist, particularly anti-Black archival description. The information is primarily intended to combat the racist structures inherent in PWIs and an archival description of the Black community, to improve the work of predominantly white archivists who handle collections about, by, and for people of the Black diaspora. Next, please. Due to the aforementioned nature of this working group consisting of mostly white women, and in order to get community input, AFRPLIP established a GoFundMe and successfully raised over $1,000 to pay Black archivists to review the resources before publishing. We're grateful to everyone who donated money to support these honoraria. The 9 individuals listed here reviewed our draft and offered feedback. We provided them with a Google form to provide suggestions to us directly or anonymously if desired, as well as the option to converse with other reviewers in the comments in a shared Google Doc. The working group thoroughly reviewed the feedback together to discuss each comment and suggestion that we incorporated into our draft. The feedback the reviewers gave was extraordinarily insightful, constructive, and essential to the success of this project, and we're very grateful to all of them for dedicating their time and expertise. Next slide, please. I'd like to briefly review some examples of specific metadata recommendations, which we grouped into 7 main categories. The section on voice and style mentions unlearning the neutral or objective voice of traditional archival description, which reinforces existing power structures in favor of a voice rooted in respect and care. In thinking about who you're writing for, we encourage archivists to consider a plurality of audiences when writing description. This involves evaluating local descriptive practices and policies using the criteria, which audiences does this description center, and which audiences does it exclude? Next slide, please. In the section focused on auditing legacy description, we advocate for providing better name access for Black people, including for both creators and subjects of records. Acknowledging the limits of provenance-based description, the recommendations encourage describing the subjects of documents about oppressed or marginalized peoples, at least to the extent that we describe the document's creators. This is based on the premise that describing a person by name is an act of affirming humanity. We also highlight the need to preserve copies of legacy description whenever we update language for the sake of transparency and so that we preserve a history of the finding aid that researchers can consult in order to understand how descriptions shifted over time. And just to briefly mention, some methods for doing this include preserving old hard copies or PDFs of finding aids, creating a publicly accessible collection of legacy finding aids, making use of local tools for tracking processing documentation, or providing a note or a link to in the current finding aid that indicates the existence of legacy finding aids. Next, please. We also provided suggestions for addressing racist description and archivist supplied versus creator supplied description. In most cases, we recommend preserving but contextualizing creator supplied description when racism is an important context for understanding records. With regards to the Library of Congress subject headings, we encourage archivists to balance discoverability with language usage thoughtfully. This can mean avoiding specific terms when they are harmful to the people they describe, as well as working with groups such as the Cataloging Lab to actively try to change harmful headings. Next slide, please. Recommendations also encourage archivists to be transparent about their collections and their work. Especially for PWIs whose collecting practices have often ignored, erased, or misrepresented the histories of Black people and other people of color, we advocate for description that acknowledges shortcomings with regards to collecting gaps, as well as institutional responsibility for creating those gaps. So for example, you see on the slide, this is actually a collections abstract which was revised recently by my colleague to be more transparent about the collection. So it says the collection consists of miscellaneous source material pertaining to the history of the American West and Southwest in the 19th century, largely from the perspective of white settlers. There are also a set of recommendations for how to address records relating to the institution of slavery. For example, using enslaved or captive as a modifier rather than the generic and dehumanizing term slave, as well as enslaver to describe those who held others in bondage. We're especially indebted to Dr. P. Gabrielle Foreman for her community source document on writing and teaching about slavery, which heavily influenced this section of the guidelines. Next slide. The working group's goal was to try to create resources that would help deepen archivists' understanding of the complex issue of describing marginalized communities and groups. So it's worth noting a few of the larger challenges that this project highlighted, many of which were reiterated during the review process. Excuse me. Much of the literature around ethical approaches to description rightfully focuses on asking communities what language they use to describe themselves and honoring it. However, communities are not monoliths. Not everyone has the same opinion about language choices. Different individuals or different parts of a community may have conflicting preferences. As a result, we need to be mindful about who we ask for input. As one reviewer suggested, it could be helpful to institute a peer or community review process to gather broader feedback. Originally thinking that we would describe the metadata implementation section as guidelines, the group realized that not all archivists are going to have the power or institutional clout to implement all of the actions we advocate for. Some of our recommendations, especially those that expose institutions' own shortcomings and racism, might be controversial. In light of this challenge, we decided to call this section recommendations rather than guidelines at the suggestion of one of the reviewers. While acknowledging this reality, we hope that the recommendations will provide actionable suggestions for both processing archivists on the ground and administrators or collectives advocating for broader policy changes. Like much of archival practice, the work the group has produced and efforts to audit description for racism in general are necessarily iterative. Terminology changes over time and best practices will evolve. Racism is still very much embedded in our society, and it will continue to find its way into archival description. A sustainable approach to anti-oppressive description means that we need to center people in all of our metadata practices and adapt our strategies for doing so over time. This involves integrating efforts to address racism into regular metadata curation workflows. Finally, I'd like to address challenges resulting from the fact that the working group is mostly white women, specifically the emotional labor that my Black colleagues endured as the rest of us educated ourselves as part of the process of working on this project. This included times when the learning of white members unfortunately came at the expense of Black members. This speaks for the need for white people to continuously and proactively question and confront how white supremacy shows up for us personally, so that we aren't learning at the expense of our friends and colleagues of color. This is especially important for white folks who are involved in projects geared toward addressing racism, so that we can produce work that is actually helpful to the communities we hope to support and to minimize the harm we cause our BIPOC collaborators in the process. Next slide, please. The working group released the bibliographies and metadata recommendations in October 2019 and added a revised version last October. You can find them on AFRIPLIP's website under resources. We're currently planning to add them to AFRIPLIP's GitHub repository that Beaudry mentioned earlier, which has our statement, to allow for better access so that we're able to document and provide updated versions and to allow the community to interact with the resources. Since their release, we've received a good deal of positive feedback from the archival community. The working group was the recipient of the 2020 SAA CFW COCA Award for description. And in addition to anecdotal feedback that members of the working group have received, we also sent out a survey to the professional community last fall to see if and how archivists and institutions are applying the resources in their description work. Excuse me, we received a great response with 50 respondents, which we were not anticipating, but is great. The group is currently analyzing this feedback to share with the community, and we may also try to oversee some sort of program or initiative for respondents to share their work with a wide audience. Next slide, please. And I'd also like to note that aspects of this project are also recounted in the March 2019 Library Juice Press publication, Ethical Questions in Name Authority Control. in the chapter entitled What's in a Name? Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia and the Impact of Names and Name Authorities in Archival Description, that was co-authored by working group members Alexis Antracoli and Katie Rodden. Members of the working group were also interviewed for a two-part article that was published in the January and April 2020 editions of the NEA newsletter. Next slide, please. Moving on to the community archives group, in support of AFRBLIP's statement for archivists to preserve Black history, the Community Archives Group seeks opportunities to advise organizations serving Black communities on archival and records management questions, and also provides direct assistance. So far, the group has worked with two partners. The photo here depicts members processing the paper-based and digital records of Rashida Phillips, a Philadelphia-based public interest lawyer, author, artist, and community activist. The finding aid we created in collaboration with Rashida is on the AFRBLIP website, and we also provided her a digital preservation guide. The collection documents organizations associated with Phillips' work as a community activist and organizer, including a community civic association in North Philadelphia, the Black Quantum Futurism Collective, which is a multidisciplinary collaboration between Phillips and Philadelphia artist and activist Kamei Ayewa, and the Community Futures Lab, which Rashida runs, which is a community center that provides a physical space for workshops, teach-ins, artistic performance and creation, and organizing space for addressing gentrification in North Philadelphia. The group has also worked with Movement Alliance Project, an organization that partners with grassroots activist groups to document their activities and use video to advance their causes, and which has a large audiovisual archives. AFRBLIP members assisted with revising a successful grant proposal for the Clear Recordings at Risk program. It also had an archivathon day at Movement Alliance where members did some on-the-spot mass metadata cleanup and wrote up a report of digital preservation guidance. And most recently, in the fall of 2020, AFRBLIP members Rachel Appel and Beaudry consulted on a preservation plan for Philly We Rise, which is part of Movement Alliance. Philly We Rise is a media hub that amplifies the work that individuals and organizations do to fight for their communities and is a resource for those who want to get involved in the movement. Rachel and Beaudry helped outline workflows and metadata needs to preserve recordings gathered at protests.
So in addition to all the great work mentioned, we have a reading group. Unlike a traditional book club, the reading group strives to build a dialogue that will lead to tangible outcomes and align with the work we're already doing with the Antiracist Description guidelines. And the reading group has three main goals. The first is to critically engage with anti-racist readings and apply the texts in our lives and in our individual institutions as much as we're able to. Two, to reaffirm AFRBLIP's commitment to build bridges between our cohort and racial justice advocacy groups in Philadelphia. Third is to take the outcomes of the group's discourse to recommend and advocate for best practices in our field that help to secure and ensure racial justice and hold racist people, policies, and institutions accountable. Currently, we have framed the reading group to be around the themes of surveillance and access. The first reading we did on the 17th was on Simone Brown's Dark Matter, on the surveillance of Blackness. From there, we will build off that reading to discuss and read more about practices and policies in the reading room in regards to surveillance and access. The hope is through the discussions, we can build out a statement or recommendations, whether it be a statement like the description guidelines or write about the challenges and recommendations through a blog post. As Faith and her subgroup evaluated the results from the survey for their guidelines, we also looked forward to new strategic goals. And these goals, which I'll mention in a moment, were designed from our membership survey that we conducted in September of 2020. Rachel Appel designed and analyzed a survey which we sent out on our listserv and had 52 respondents. The member survey provided not only a framework for our future endeavors, but it helped us understand the composition of our group. As you can see, the majority of our members are from academic institutions, and we are somewhat evenly split on our membership expanding beyond Philadelphia, really making this group more of a national entity. Another thing to point out from our membership survey is the majority of our members are white and identify as female. The results are not too surprising as they align with other National Association surveys from SAA and LAA, but remains disappointing reflection of our professional field. It's not quite as diverse as we hope and strive for. Though membership widens considerably and is a reflection of how many people in our field are invested in learning more about anti-racist work and contributing to discussions around dismantling white supremacy. So to return to my early point of the survey, it was designed to help shape the future direction. We asked people what they were looking for in our group in the next year, as well as what they had participated previously. From the results of the survey, the organizing committee recently did some strategic planning for the next 2 years. One of the key directions is for us to be a more formalized entity with a clearly documented governance. But more importantly for our members is an expanding on 4 areas: building on our community archives, provide cultural competency and social justice training in the form of workshops, webinars, or panel discussions. Another is to expand on our communication. We've recently created a Twitter, but we want to utilize our network and create more blogs and zines. And lastly, explore fundraising for scholarships, internship opportunities, and such. This concludes our presentation. So thank you everybody for joining us, and please reach out if you would like to be involved or learn more about the group.
Wonderful presentation, and I think that it serves as a powerful reminder, especially during Black History Month, that we future archivists have a role to play in pushing for anti-racist practices and values in repositories. So thank you very much. And we're now going to be transitioning away from the presentation and toward the Q&A. So if you have any questions for Beaudry and Faith, please type them into the chat, or you can take the mic and ask them yourself.
And actually, I see that Allison posted a question to the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure. So just in case folks don't see, the question is there a possibility that SAA will endorse the anti-racist description resources similar to their endorsement of the protocols for Native American archival materials? That is a good question. We've actually, the organizing team has talked recently about, communicating with SAA kind of about the future of the resources, how they're going to be maintained, like what, in terms of what body would do that, like what makes sense, like should our group continue to do that? Because, again, in terms of like bandwidth and resources that we have, that might be kind of difficult. Whereas obviously an organization like SAA, or maybe even a regional archival professional community might make more sense. So yeah, those are discussions that we're having now. And I think the idea is to reach out to SAA as one of those organizations to see, if and how they might kind of take up the mantle for the resources.
We have a couple of comments and questions in the chat. There's one from Indira, I hope I'm saying that correctly, who is expressing that this presentation is really hitting close to home for her. And we have a question from Hillary, and she says, I'm a first semester grad student at SJSU, and I'm very interested in getting involved. How can I best be of service given that I'm just a beginner?
Oh, everybody's welcome to join. I recommend joining our listserv. We kind of consider if you join our listserv, you're a member. And from there, you can kind of see areas that you want to volunteer or be more involved in. I'm putting in the chat our website so you can get more information on joining our listserv and more information about our resources. But like I said, you know, there is no expectation of joining with any experience. So even if you're just interested or want to be a lurker, you're more than welcome to just join.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, especially in these times, we're trying to, you know, do things virtually, you know, especially so that more people can participate. But I think in terms of particularly some of like the community archives projects that we might be able to do in the future, you know, they'll probably hopefully be in person, you know, and kind of focused on Philadelphia area organizations. But again, we're kind of trying to, especially now, like with the reading group and even some of the community archives initiatives, like the one I mentioned for Movement Alliance, those were done virtually. So trying to see, you know, how we can do that also.
Great. We have another question here, which is a similar one that I had, and it says, what are your thoughts on Library of Congress subject headings in anti-racist descriptive terms?
I think those are two arguments that align with each other. Those are two fights that are similar. I think as archivists, we have an interesting opportunity to sort of circumvent the bureaucracy of subject headings and really as a collective be able to push out recommendations and best practices. But I think we're fighting the same fight. One of the things too that I find really interesting is, you know, the success of anti-racist work is not siloed just in the archives, but in the library in general. Is like, how is our finding aids being cataloged? So we have to sort of work together on that fight. I'm actually really interested in the technology aspect of it, is that we're also not technologically advanced in our cataloging system to make a lot of local changes. So it's a bigger fight for the LOC to make those changes.
Yeah, and I can add to that. I agree with what you said, Beaudry, and like I mentioned, in case people are interested, it's not an extensive amount of recommendations, but the Antiracist Description resources does have, like I mentioned, some recommendations for dealing with subject headings, you know, Library of Congress headings. And I know some institutions, and Princeton is looking to do this at some point in the near future that I can speak to, is having a set of local terms to use instead of LC subject headings. So the idea would be to use those subject headings on the back end, you know, so that we can maintain those linkages and authoritative headings and, you know, any sort of like linked data projects and whatnot until the Library of Congress updates those. But until that time, also have a set of local terms that would appear when someone, you know, enters a harmful term. So the interface would show the local term, the backend would still have, you know, the harmful term until that's updated by LC. So trying to do something like that. We haven't, Princeton hasn't implemented this yet, but like I said, I can't think of any institutions off the top of my head, but I know others are doing similar work.
Yeah, Villanova did that. And I think that's sort of the issues that we're having is we were able to locally make the change in our subject headings, but we have to have a like constant maintenance on those catalog records to make sure that in a new update, we don't lose our local headings, and then we revert back to LOC's subject headings. So it's a really interesting process, and we're definitely more cognizant of it now as Villanova is migrating to a new cataloging system. And so we're trying to navigate that territory of crosswalking our local subject heading overlay to a new system.
Sorry, just out of curiosity, is Villanova also migrating to Alma?
No.
Oh. Okay. I know that's what Princeton's doing. And again, that's kind of outside my purview, so I don't really know much about it, but okay, I was just curious.
Lillian here is expressing excitement about these links in the book club. She says that she volunteers for protest access and has a lot of coworkers that would be interested in this. She also has a question. She says, are you doing anything to make sure disabled Black people's voices are heard in this anti-racist description project?
That's a really good question. I don't believe we specifically talk about disabled Black communities. You'd think I'd remember since I was one of the authors of it, but it's been a while since I've looked at the whole thing. But yeah, I'm not sure if we specifically talk about that group, but I mean, that's, you know, obviously something that should be discussed and should be addressed. And I should say too, you know, the resources that we created and the metadata recommendations, you know, that are a part of that, we're really thinking of those as kind of a springboard for others to use, you know, as appropriate, but also to build on, because, you know, this is kind of like just the beginning of this work. And so we would love for, you know, more people, again, to kind of like build on them and, you know, expand them. So yeah, that's a really good point, and a group that should definitely be recognized and focused on for sure.
Yeah, and SAA in, I believe, the last year has formed the accessibility and disability section. So I would recommend sort of joining those, that group to pose that question, because I'm not familiar with any groups talking about disability and accessibility in description, but I think that would be a great place to ask that question, or maybe kind of poke a few people to start creating some type of recommendations.
I think that's a great idea. We have another question. It's a set of questions. It says, I know that you mentioned that this group is mainly made up of white archivists, but what is your organization doing to reach out to Black archivists as well? Also, and this may have already been explained, but will you be involving community input from Black folks in Pennsylvania in your strategic planning and making sure to check in with them?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I mean, we do, and sorry, Audrey, I don't know if you had this in your slide about the demographic makeup of the group thus far. You know, there is, unfortunately, it's a fairly small representation of the group that identify as Black. You know, and like Beaudry said, unfortunately, that's kind of a reflection of the profession as a whole or at large. But that is reaching out to Black archivists specifically. That's not really something that we've discussed, or I guess kind of established or tried to establish approaches of how we might do that. You know, one of the things that we really wanted to do is to try and at least have some representation, I can speak, on the organizing team in particular, to try and get, you know, more input and feedback. Right now, one of the 4 members of the organizing team, she's actually not an archivist, but she's a digital humanities scholar. I think her title is Digital Scholarship Librarian at the University of Pennsylvania, Jennifer Garcon, who's really great. But yeah, we haven't really kind of established like any sort of plan or kind of like action items to reach out specifically to Black archivists to try and get those folks more involved, you know, obviously as they're willing and able. And in terms of the second question about involving getting community input from Black folks and the Philadelphia area, that's also a really good point, and probably something we should try to do more of. We have talked before about, you know, in particular, reaching out to public libraries in the city to try thinking about like who we might be able to partner with to have kind of more of a presence and more of a conversation with various communities in the city. So obviously that would include, you know, majority Black communities in the city. So that is something we've talked about, but not something that we've actively done as of yet. Beaudry, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I think you covered a lot of it. That's not I don't want to say it's not a priority, but it's one of the things that we have to act on very carefully, that we're not engaging with people and putting a lot of emotional labor on them to join something that maybe they're not particularly interested in joining, or making people feel like they need to continue the Black labor in their profession. And I think what the question about involving community input from Black folks in our strategic planning is, we are really looking at new ways to engage in community archive opportunities.
Monica here has made a really good point that a lot of our attendees agree with. She said, when I think about diversity in the profession, I sometimes think that the graduate degree requirement is a big and perhaps unnecessary barrier to becoming an archivist, and that there ought to be alternative routes such as work practice. I'm wondering if I'm the only one thinking this.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't really something that the group has discussed, and not really something that we're kind of involved with in terms of, you know, education in the field and kind of what is typically expected or required. But I 100% agree with that. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think some institutions, I mean, it might be a minority. I don't study this and I don't have like numbers or anything off the top of my head, but I think there are some institutions that do still have, you know, like not necessarily an MLS background, but maybe a public history background, or like a history background with an archives concentration. But even that, I think that work experience should also be considered equally. So yeah. Agree.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's classist gatekeeping of, you need to have a higher education. And there's lots of racist nuances in that. You know, it's really hard of like, what point of entry do we really tackle that? But yes, 100% that is an issue, and it continues to be an issue.
Lillian here's asking, is there a way we can contact you to exchange notes about how to get community involvement?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Beaudry said, I think the listserv would be a good way to do that. We would like that communication line to be more active, and kind of folks, you know, talking amongst them, like membership or members talking amongst themselves and pinging ideas back and forth. That's happened to a small degree, but I think maybe not as much as we would like. So, I mean, it's really, you know, a forum for folks to use as they would like. And I think maybe bringing up ideas through that channel would be really useful. I guess I should also say too that, and I don't think either Beaudry or I mentioned this in the presentation, but one of the things, again, in terms of, you know, trying to get people more engaged and interacting with our membership, as much as people have time and are interested, we're going to be opening up our organizing team meetings. We have monthly meetings, and I think we're going to open them up on a quarterly basis for anyone who wants to attend and have a conversation and get feedback that way. So we're hoping that, you know, that proves to be a beneficial approach.
I have a question for you both. I know that that A4Blip has these general metadata recommendations. Do you ever go into a specific institution and offer very specific metadata recommendations based on what they have?
We have not done that because although the working group authored these and did a lot of research, I don't know if any of us would consider ourselves experts. And it really, a couple of folks from institutions have asked about that after we released the resources, like, hey, like we want to start implementing this. Can you know, see if we're going in the right direction? You know, and I think we're happy to do that to a degree, but it really, because it's so much of it depends on local practices and, you know, kind of like the environment in which you're working. And yeah, it just seems like there are many ways that the recommendations as a whole or in parts could be implemented. So yeah, we really haven't done any like workshops or anything to that degree. And that's why I was saying, like, the survey that we put out about, you know, seeing whether institutions or individuals are using these, I think we would really like to try and have some sort of like panel or even like blog series or something to provide case studies so that more folks can see how other institutions are implementing these. Princeton has, I'm on Princeton's Inclusive Description Working Group, and we have incorporated, you know, the resources into our kind of local practices at this point. And I believe Yale has, Jessica Tai has written about this, and I forget if anyone else from Yale, but definitely Jessica Tai has written about the work that they've done in terms of inclusive description and their collections on Japanese incarceration during World War II. So yeah, it's just tricky because I think they could be incorporated in various ways depending on the institution and the collections they have and the projects that they're working on. Sorry, that was kind of a long-winded response, but did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And kind of piggybacking off of that, Allison asks, have you ever talked to counterparts at HBCUs about the vocabularies or terms they use to describe their collections?
No, but that's a great idea. Yeah, no, I mean, again, we, as part of that review kind of component to the resources, where we reached out to, you know, several Black archivists who reviewed, obviously there's only 9 folks, and it's just like a very, very small subset. And while you know, their feedback was great and they have a lot of great expertise, I think, yeah, reaching out to HBCUs would be great. And this actually makes me think, not to keep bringing it back to Princeton, but that's just, since that's where I work and I know what's going on, Princeton has actually had a program now for 2 years where we we've been partnering with a couple of HBCUs, and we've had like an Archives 101 boot camp for a week. It's called the Arch program. And we invite undergraduate and graduate students from HBCUs to participate. So sorry, I'm just like thinking out loud. We already have a connection with some of these institutions. And even though obviously A4BLIP is not Princeton affiliated, it just so happens that a lot of Princeton folks worked on the resources. Yeah, that would be a really good approach. But yeah, generally speaking, I think having that conversation and making informed decisions based on those conversations and dialogue, you know, specifically with historically Black colleges and universities and their archives is a really good idea.
Have you received any negative, surprising pushback about any of your metadata recommendations from any organizations or individuals?
I think we'll have a better sense of that from the survey because we literally like just started reviewing the feedback. And it was a long survey. It was, I think, about 15 questions, and a lot of them were, you know, long form or kind of open-ended response questions. So yeah, I'm curious whether anyone who has tried to do so has received pushback. Again, talking about Princeton, we have not really. The head of our archival description and processing team, Alexis Antracoli, who is also one of the authors, is clearly very on board with this, and she helped author the resources. So we have a lot, she, you know, provides a lot of support and advocacy for our work. But yeah, like I said in the presentation, we realize that everyone's going to be in a different situation, and they might not have the power or the authority or kind of the influence at their institution, you know, to, I guess, implement the recommendations in full. But we hope maybe even like parts of it, if folks are able to, or maybe even just to get a conversation started at your institution. Because again, I think a lot of institutions and places are really now focusing on inclusive description and addressing, you know, harmful legacy description. So I think it's a trend that's continuing to grow, which is really nice to see.
Yes, and to round out this presentation, we have a couple more questions. One student has asked how they could best be involved with A4BLIP, and if you have any contact information that you can provide the attendees.
Yeah, like we previously mentioned, joining our listserv is the best way to get in contact. And then are you asking for our personal contacts, our personal emails? Because we also have a general one I can put in the chat.
I think the general one could work. They didn't specify. Well, I think those are all the questions that we have from our attendees. We have a lot of them saying thank you for your good work. It was really great to have you both come speak with us. And I know that I've learned a lot. And Allison, do you have any closing words?
I do. Thank you so much. This is sort of where I come in as like the pledge drive person, where I'm going to share my screen real quick and remind everyone, like, hey, if you enjoyed this presentation and you want to be involved in bringing more presentations like this to the iSchool and SAASC members, we are having elections this April. So you can be the person that brings to light these really important conversations. I mean, like the whole time I was just, and I posted this comment, I was thinking about how I talked about a lot of these issues in my e-portfolio submissions for a couple of the competencies. So these are really critical discussions that we're having in this profession, and as students we're going to be facing as we build our careers. And it's a great way for you to kind of learn more about these issues, get involved, try to address these issues. I feel like progress is kind of a slow trickle, but people like Beaudry and Faith, they're like the people that are trying to make this stuff happen. So we have elections coming up in April. Everything is up for election. These are all the positions that are open. We're going to be posting more details about each one soon. And, you know, I really strongly recommend you nominate yourself for one of these positions. So click on the link for the website or our contact address if you want to learn more. And that's my big plug for joining SAASC. But also, you know, we posted some links to some of the SSA section groups. That's another great way to get involved and bring up these issues, because I think the more people talk about it, the more people, you know, make recommendations, make some actions towards progress. I think that's how we're going to actually see change happen. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Faith and Beaudry. That was an amazing presentation and really, really informative and important. So that's all I have to say. Samantha, anything else?
No, that's it. Just thank you both very much for coming and speaking with us, and for everyone who came here today and attended the event. Thank you so much.
All right, good night, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.